So welcome everyone to the S word, Stanislavsky and Intimacy. Thank you all for joining us for the 5th of our ongoing series of webinars, which are presented in collaboration with the Stanislavsky Research Centre. My name is Joelle Ray Arp-Dunham, and I'm the media editor for Stanislavsky Studies. The S word is a collaborative research project and with partners all over the world. The project was started to explore the work and legacy of Konstantin Stanislavsky in the context of contemporary theater performance and related media. During the COVID crisis, we have not been able to present our usual symposia, and like many other projects, we've taken our work online, but we are planning major live events for 2022. We've kept busy during the pandemic though, and recently launched our website, Stanislavsky Here Today Now. On it, you can find a plethora of videos and other materials from a wide variety of scholars and practitioners. And in fact, the video of this webinar will be on there too, so if you want to share it later on with someone, you'll be able to do that. In addition, we are developing a new series of publications which will focus on the webinar's topics, and we'll be launching these in the near future as well. Now, to focus on Stanislavsky and intimacy, while researching Stanislavsky and cognitive science for my dissertation, I noticed that what I was finding strongly supported the concepts and the practices of the work I was doing with theatrical intimacy. And yet I was hearing grumbles from several directors that using the protocols and choreography would inhibit a truthful performance. It seemed like a great topic for the S word to explore. And I want to thank Paul Fryer, who's co-director of the Stanislavsky Research Centre and co-founder of the S word, Stefan Aquilina, the co-director of the center, and Jonathan Pitch is the deputy director of the center, for encouraging and promoting today's webinar. I also want to thank the Department of Theatre and Cinema at Radford University for hosting this event and all of today's esteemed panel members. Finally, I want to introduce the moderators of today's webinar. Robin Berg is MFA and associate professor, come very soon. Congratulations, Robin, at Radford University. And we have Molly Hood, is MFA and assistant professor at Radford University as well. It's all yours, Molly.
Great. Thank you all. Before we start, just a 1 minute on the format of the webinar, which will be as follows. The speakers will each have about 10 minutes during which they will put forward their intervention or provocation. After the set of presentations, we can then open for discussion and for questions. Please send your questions in the question and answer portal at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to do so at any point during the webinar. So you don't need to wait for the 5 presentations to be over to submit your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Stanislavsky Here Today Now website. Robin, would you like to introduce our panelists for today?
I would love to. Thank you, Molly. So before I introduce the panelists, I just want to set us up a little bit and say that the provocation or umbrella question for today is, how do Stanislavskian acting practices work with theatrical intimacy protocols and theatrical intimacy in a broader sense? So to discuss Stanislavsky and intimacy, we have an esteemed international panel, and that includes Vanessa Ewan, Dan Grenke, Joelle Ray Arp-Dunham, Kaya Dunn, and Emily Raleigh. First and foremost, we are going to hear from Vanessa. Vanessa Ewan is at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in the UK. And today she will talk about working from self. It's not personal. Vanessa?
Hello. Hello. Thank you for inviting me. It's such a rich landscape of practitioners. I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone, and also to the Q&A. I am reading from my notes, so there will be no movement to watch or visuals through my presentation. So please feel free to not look at me. I'm offering a perspective from a conservatoire setting. So I work across a broad range of movement subjects and with actors at all stages, both in training and in the profession. And my philosophy in all my work is to empower the actor, whether I'm working with movement directors and teachers or in the rehearsal room myself, to understand and never to underestimate the vulnerability of the lone actor. Actor movement as a subject has always been acutely aware that it is working with raw material of the human condition expressed through movement. It involves the development of the personal human instrument as a vehicle to express humanity in all its rawness, as well as the body stories related to simply being. The actor is at the center of everything I do. So the actor is a specialist of working within the intricate web of a process. Now, within the conservatoire, the actor is given time to learn. It is a 3-year journey, and their learning follows a map that shifts not just through stages, but offers parallel philosophies. And this results in the actor having a richness that leads to autonomy. And so they emerge at the end of their 3-year training with a process bespoke to them, which draws on an intricate web of tools, techniques, and approaches. So when you acknowledge the intricate web of learning that you are offering your actors or practitioners as directors or teachers or movement directors, you must also take on an awareness of the gaps, the liminal, the areas that you have possibly neglected. Intimacy is certainly often in this neglected category, but for the actor, neglect is not an option. The actor has been held in a wonderful web of process, a created world which is full and meaningful, and then they find themselves in a situation with no real support. So the actor often discovers that intimacy has not been included within the learning on offer and within the intricate web. When faced with intimacy work, the actor is forced to uphold their nuanced process the best they can, with nothing but their personal response to go to. So the result is that their offer is one that is completely drawn from the personal. Now, this successfully fills the gap in the intricate web of their process, but it makes them wholly unsafe. You will all recognize this. I am a great believer in the actor and their process, and responding to a role through a complex web of tools, techniques, and approaches is a full occupation. Being fully occupied in this way prevents the personal coming in. The actor uses their process to respond as a professional. This provides a level of safety in the work that we can acknowledge. In intimate work, the actor should not be using their own personal movement identity. So working from self must be clearly understood as not meaning working as self, using personal context, divulging personal past, or using a personal movement map. The actor is skilled at filtering and nuancing to develop a bespoke process fitted to themselves. So they are able to learn a spectrum of ideologies and find themselves through integrating different parts of each. The philosophy of acting intimacy should be shaped so that it can fit in with any acting philosophy and become an integral element of any actor training course. Any overt contradictions between the philosophy of acting and intimacy work with all the other components of acting that the actor uses as part of their process will make the actor unsafe in the intimate work. If there is a conflict of approaches, the actor will be forced to make a choice, and there will be an implicit demand that they abandon their process, the very process that they know and that keeps them safe. So the guidelines must be bespoke to the course mission. Guidelines provide another essential layer of safety, but the conservatoire must have a shared language and learn from the different areas of the training that the actor undertakes. We must provide a process for intimacy work that integrates and aligns with all the different learning that the actor undertakes, and therefore fits within the complex web of learning. The guidelines cannot be felt as contradictory to this wonderful and complex route into acting that any given conservatoire is offering. They must fit with the philosophies of acting that the actor is experiencing throughout the different areas of their training. Any clash will possibly render the actor unsafe, as they will likely choose the rigor of the acting processes they have been taught over a rule about safety. If we see the conservatoire as holding the task of preparing the actor to navigate their own safety when in the industry, simply obeying a set of guidelines and having the actors learn some rules is not enough. The real task is to empower the actor, and this is what is possible through actor movement. Guidelines can take care of the present situation, but they can also inhibit inquiry, so they have to be offered along with a process that manages the complexity inherent in the actor's learning. We must remember that the actor is the only one who encounters the journey through the whole learning map. For the actor, a misled understanding of self can lead them to offering the personal. And I would say that in any acting situation, bringing in the personal is potentially unsafe, but in an intimate situation, it is absolutely unsafe. While a student, the actor needs clarity to not draw on the personal so that they remain safe when it comes to working on intimacy. So an example of a guideline might be to ask the actor not to use their own personal movement, not to share any examples of their own intimate experiences, and not to share their own personal intimate narratives. During the work, therefore, the language used around self must be accurately offered, with an understanding that it could easily be confused with the personal. This is crucial, and so you would expect there to be clarity around this as standard practice. But even so, there are times when the actor can be left confused. The personal is that singular actor's way of being, the outcome of the threads of their life, a web of everything that constitutes that person. Theirs is one way of being out of at least 6.2 billion other options. If you for a moment imagine yourself as a character, you see that you are complex. Your movement is an intricate map of your life and your genetic code. And there is no one else like you, no one else who moves like you. And this complexity means that to become someone else, you need to change very little. You change your relationship to weight and you will be completely different. Your relationship to time or your relationship to space. Or you change your circumstance and there is a shift to a safe distance from your personal self. Learning how to create these specific changes through actor movement empowers the actor to transform away from their personal self and leave it safely out of the work at hand. The actor in training experiences ways of seeing and being through the 3 years of their training, which gives them a constantly expanding understanding. As their vocabulary develops, it clarifies to them that their personal is personal and should remain as such. This understanding cannot come too late after they have accidentally given themselves away. They must be kept safe from the beginning of their training and not learn this lesson only through error once they have had negative experiences through exposing too much of their personal self. When creating an active character from an intricate and complex process, it takes time to result in something that will feel as rich as the personal self. The actor should be encouraged to invest in this process and never to result to using the personal self as a shortcut to something that feels rich, but leaves them exposed and unsafe in the work. Intimacy is ever present for the actor. It is what they do. The actor is always in relationship. They let the audience in, they let the other actors in. They become the world they are offering, they relinquish to their circumstances. They are the vehicle for what it is to be human. They are intimate in connection through all facets of self, through their constant connection to the other. There are prolific mechanisms put in place for an actor's safety from inside acting philosophies and offered within the conservatoire. These should be understood and filtered through into the industry, and yet the actor is so often left unsafe. I first began to compare the creation of an intimate scene to the creation of a fight scene as a way for me to alert the actor to a set of safety mechanisms that they had learnt in a cool way. In a fight scene, the actor is working on illusion in a medium that is easier to separate from the personal. Killing someone becomes an exciting and creative thing to do. I created this analogy between the two types of work to help the actor realize that they could translate protocols and processes across from one to the other. At the time, before Me Too, it was difficult to be overt about intimacy work as a tangled and problematic area of concern. So this was a way of me communicating safety mechanisms for intimacy work without focusing on or highlighting the systemic problems. I think it is very important that the industry has now responded to these issues. Ita O'Brien championed my analogy of fight scenes to intimacy scenes, so intimacy work could be understood, and this opened doors. Now there are intimacy coordinators that hold an accepted role and are without doubt making the workplace safer for all actors, both with and without formal training. The industry is more directly financially driven than the conservatoire, so the guidelines in the industry need to be tight and the holding needs to be simple and clear to ensure all actors are safe. The conservatoire is or should be student-driven, actor-driven. And teaching safety during intimacy work is a particular responsibility that falls within the remit of actor movement. But I thread this learning within the conservatoire through the actor's 3 years of training. There are overt safety elements embedded in most of the work that is engaged with within a conservatoire setting. However, there are also vital hidden safety mechanisms embedded in all the learning the actor undertakes when training in actor movement. The actor learns how to be open and free and yet feel physically that they are safe. They learn to own and implement processes that can navigate them through complex situations with know-how that they can translate and apply for themselves. Acting, as you know, is an extremely sophisticated art form, and actor movement aims to meet that sophistication. I don't think there is one actor movement exercise that does not have inbuilt embodied safety mechanisms. For instance, the safety mechanism in the transition the actor learns how to make as they move from one space to another through a doorway. A daily repetition of this transition allows the actor to identify the difference between the them in the corridor to the them in the rehearsal room. The difference between the them in the street and the them in the workplace is an embodied knowledge which can be translated to the similar shift between the them in the wings and the them in performance. Embodied practices of shift are embedded so deeply that the actors think nothing of them. It is unlikely that they will have consciously understood how they have learnt to shift their mode depending on the space and to embody these practices of transition from one space to another. But their body story inside the acting work has the confidence of someone that is safe because they are using this embodied learning as part of their process. I propose that conscious, well-timed, drip-fed engagement with what the student already knows and is currently learning offers safety for the actor because it allows consistent occupation in their craft. It hands them agency and responsibility during all stages of their work. They are empowered to control the narrative of their own process and to keep themselves safe within the work. And it enables the actor to offer their unique creative approaches responsibly and confidently in whatever challenging setting they find themselves in. It frees them to make the choices that are creatively bold, but safe in terms of their own well-being. The responsibility of actor movement as one strand in the actor's complex web of learning is to provide the conditions for empowerment and teach the actor how to find answers from within the safety of their carefully constructed individual process. Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Next up is Dan Grenke from the University of South Florida, an intimacy director with IDC, Intimacy Directors and Coordinators, with their presentation, Intimacy and the If.
Sorry, I coughed right on top of that. Intimacy and the If. Stanislavsky and Intimacy in the Imagination is really what I want to address. I will quote and name page numbers. I'm using this edition, the hardbound An Actor's Work, which is both An Actor Prepares and Building a Character A and B, with the Benedetti translation from Routledge. I'm not super scholarly, so forgive me if you need more information than that. But I'd like to start out with a quote from page 48. If is the lever which lifts us out of the world of reality and into the only world where we can be creative. Another quote from page 60. You now know, he said, Torstov, that our work begins by introducing the magic if into our play and role. And this lifts the actor out of everyday life into the world of the imagination. The play, the role, our stories, a series of magic and other ifs, that's important, both of those, given circumstances which the author has made up. And genuine facts, the normal world, do not exist on stage. The normal world is not art. I hadn't read these words since I was a high school student who was thinking that theater was cool and was reading books that were way above where I was at. And so I read them because our theory teacher who teaches our capstone class at University of South Florida said, you know, I have all these actors, they don't want to read theory. Can you come in and do performance work with them to talk about how it connects the theory to performance? And so, of course, I thought I'd better go back and read some of these texts that are being assigned. And I read this and was just kind of blown away because I had totally lost the idea somewhere along the line in my education and in my career that Stanislavski was about the imagination. I thought it was about the real world. I thought it was about the personal that Vanessa was just talking about. And so I was sitting here reading this and going, I'm missing something. And so I went back to Stanislavski and started to read. And it was fun, honestly, for the seminar to come back and reread some of Stanislavski and say, oh, geez, what are the things, the assumptions that have been built into me by what I'm going to call generalized American academic acting? And so much of what the people I think who are resistant to intimacy protocols and that doesn't fit with Stanislavski are people who actually don't do Stanislavski. They do generalized American academic acting. I'll talk a little more about what that is. If you actually read through Stanislavski, and this comes from the chapter of action, if, and given circumstances, which are kind of the three core things if you are interested in Stanislavski's system. These things are fundamentally compatible with intimacy direction and intimacy protocols. You know, if and imagination. This is about that fundamental disconnection from a real self, that thing that Vanessa was just addressing. And is about the fact that we use intimacy to say we are not using ourselves, that we are using our imaginations, and that no matter how close that imagination is to some sort of reality, it is still one step removed. And that for me is in terms of the IDC, the process that I learned through IDI really before IDC was a thing, is this idea of closure and opening, that we create a separation between ourselves and the work, that crossing the threshold that Vanessa was talking about. To me, the work of physical action, and I'll expound upon this, connects directly to choreography. That is what choreography is. It is a series of physical actions. And given circumstances is absolutely what context work is. And I think even if you read Stanislavski, the idea that things other than the playwright's stage directions or things in the story affect given circumstances, I think that's right in the work. And I'll address those with some quotes. Why someone might think Stanislavski is incompatible, I think has to do again with that idea of there's this generalized American academic acting that's taught that includes Stanislavski, but also a bunch of post-Stanislavskian American, mostly some British theorists who have added things and changed things and brought new threads into the teaching process in academia, in actor training that may not actually really be Stanislavskian in the sense of going back to the core work. And this is created, there's confusion here. And so like some of the things that I always thought of as Stanislavskian because of my training, because of the people I worked with as an academic, the verbing process, some people call it tactics, some people call it actions. I like to call it verbing to help clarify it from physical actions. But that idea of adding a gerund, a to verb to all of your lines, that was developed later. Goats, the thing that Richard Cohen teaches, that was developed later, certainly inspired and influenced by Stanislavski. Many of us are aware that there's a deep conflation between Lee Strasberg's method and Stanislavski's system. I was recently reading a text by a Canadian playwright, Jordan Tannehill, that's from 2016, where he easily and naturally conflated the two And I was very surprised that somebody who had that level of integration in education in the world of the theater is still confusing those two things. Hagen's substitution, that incredibly personal addition of stuff to the work, is something that gets conflated in the Stanislavski system. Again, clearly related and maybe inspired by and describing similar things that are truths that exist outside of Stanislavski's system, but not actually the Stanislavski system. And then, of course, the huge influence of Stanford Meisner in contemporary American actor training and any sort of improv training that's designed to get to impulse, which brings me to some of the things that are problematic artistically and educationally about the generalized American academic acting approach. What's in common in all of these things is a strong sense of mind-body dichotomy. That it's all about the mind, it's all about the psychological, and it's all about authentic impulse, that it's this thing that comes from within us, and that it is the physical expression is ultimately unimportant, which I'll get to a quote in a minute. That's not what Stanislavski says. Priorities of a culturally specious notion of authenticity. What is real? Again, we hear these words reality, they're so loaded for us. So I think that's something we need to address. There's a deep media complicity in this, because obviously it's much, much cooler to write actor disassociates and can't tell whether they're the character at the grocery store than it is to write actor does basic work and goes home and sips tea, right? These things are things that are deeply rooted in our cult, at least in American culture, I can say, in white American culture. The exercise is not the performance. We see these exercises and we start to think, it's what's profound in the studio is not necessarily profound on stage. The exercise trains the actor. It's not the process of actually acting. And of course, the fact that the byproduct of breakthroughs is sometimes emotional release. And so we start chasing the byproduct as opposed to the actual breakthrough. I wonder how many breakthroughs happen in acting class that no one even notices. So when you look at belief and truth, Stanislavski says on page 153, when there is no reality on stage and you have acting, then the creation of truth and belief needs to be prepared in advance. That means the truth and belief first arise in the imagination and as an artistic vision, which is then translated on stage. On page 162. In Burning Money with Kostya today, we plotted a line of physical actions and gave life to it. That line is a kind of path. You know it well enough in real life, but on stage you have to beat it anew. It starts to sound like choreography to me. Again, choreography can be dull if it's not beaten anew each time, but it's choreography. On page 165, we actors need to make full use of the fact that these physical actions acquire great value within the context of the given circumstances. Then there is an interaction between mind and body, action and feeling, thanks to which the outer helps the inner and the inner helps the outer. I'll quote the great Japanese acting teacher Yoshio Ida here. If you think you're only doing a movement, you're fooling yourself. And this is something that those of us who practice intimacy protocols understand fundamentally, that doing an action has consequences for the person doing it. And so we need to help create that separation, that closure. That choreography can be a line that takes us into a place where the inner is lit on fire. And so these things are all fundamental to choreography. I'm going to skip a little bit of this quote, but when you read about given circumstances, and if you want to look on it on page 53, he gives you the list that includes plot and stage direction and all of these things. But in there, he includes how we as actors and directors understand the piece, the contributions we ourselves make. He ends the list with etc. Everything which is a given for the actors as they rehearse, which I would argue includes their boundaries, which I would argue includes an awareness of who your audience is, what the venue is, the cultures that the people in the room bring to the room. All of those things are part of the given circumstances. And I think even in Stanislavski's writing is pointing at that. And we've lost sight of that because we've tried to shut those things out, at least again, in the predominantly white institutions that teach acting in America. Can intimacy be something that we do rotely? I believe so, yes. Can intimacy be compatible with this more generalized American academic acting? Yes, I actually think it can, but the key response I would have to anybody who says that this is constraining, this is too tight, this is stopping impulse, is Stanislavski says on page 62. And what about all the author's stage directions? The director's demands, the moves, the mise-en-scene, and the whole production. Is it really enough to remember them and carry them out as a formal pattern? And the answer is no. All this has to be filled out and given depth by the actor. Only then, as everything given us by the author and the rest of the production team only then does it stir the innermost recesses of the heart in the actor and the audience and bring it to life. So there's always room for an actor, even in the most minute details, to stop that generalization that Stanislavski hates. So that would be my response to the idea that intimacy is somehow incompatible with Stanislavski's system.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Good stuff so far, everybody. We are going to move on to a face you've already seen briefly at the top of today's presentation. Joelle Ray Arp Dunham has both a PhD and an MFA, and she teaches at Radford University. She is also the media editor of Stanislavski Studies. And today, Joelle will be talking about an intimate look at Stanislavski's primary and secondary emotions. Joelle?
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate that. This is exciting today to be here. So thank you all. I'm going to share my screen for a second here, because I'm going kind of deeply into a couple things, and I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to see what I'm talking about as well as hear about it. So Stanislavski was concerned with the ethics of performance throughout his career. He considered the actor to be the co-creator of a performance, not a passive receptacle for the director. Maria Shevtsova suggests that this requires thoughtfulness towards scene partners and awareness of their sensitivities, needs, and wants. Stanislavski extends this necessity for respect to the entire team, including theatrical managers who exploit, his word, actors. His concern for ethics and what he called the mental hygiene of actors resonates with the ideas of consent and bodily autonomy at the heart of theatrical intimacy work. I also want to address the fallacy that Dan has referred to so well, about that he was only concerned with a naturalistic verisimilitude in theater, which would be antithetical to the specific choreography of stage intimacy. Stanislavski scholars such as Sharon Carnegie, David Krasner, and Maria Shevtsova, among others, have attempted to correct this misunderstanding, but as Dan said, it remains pervasive in the public imagination. A sense of truth was certainly key to the system, but this truth is one of artistic imagination and analogous feelings, not verisimilitude, and certainly not only realism. Now, what are true emotions for Stanislavski? He's distinguished two types of emotion. The first, primary emotions, are what are experienced the first time we have an emotional event. Strong emotion memory can produce these primary feelings. These spontaneous, strong, highly colored re-experiences rarely happen during performance, though. But when they do, Stanislavski says, it's annoying. We do not control moments of primary experience. They control us. For him, secondary or repeated emotions are analogous to primary emotions, but are much easier to control and can therefore be more useful for the actor. Now, current models of cognitive science support this differentiation. During primary emotional events, the amygdala, often thought of as the emotion center, is highly activated. Sharon Carnegie points out that Stanislavski wrote that secondary emotions are the crucible in which emotion is transformed into art. While primary emotions are difficult to control and lead to hysteria, Stanislavski's word, secondary emotions can be shaped to suit the needs of the story and therefore reach the audience in a stronger, more artistic fashion. Restraint is the prime quality of the good actor, Stanislavski says. But when the amygdala is highly activated in primary emotion, control is difficult. But secondary emotions have a different brain pathway. During secondary emotions, the prefrontal cortex is more highly activated. This part of the brain is associated with reasoning, planning, personality expression, and moderating social behavior. This control center allows for artistic shaping of emotion. This artistic use of real emotion ties back to Stanislavski's concept of truthful living on stage. The intellect and emotions must be manipulated in order to produce an artistic creation. Since primary emotions are uncontrollable, they cannot be manipulated. Instead, secondary emotions must be employed. Primary emotions, the state in which the actor's body is experiencing emotion in a first-person perspective as if it was happening to them in the moment, can occur during performance, but they are rare and spontaneous events. Since they are uncontrollable, they can lead to inartistic actions on stage. Stanislavski was specifically referring to inartistic actions that do not support the narrative or character. And I assert that primary emotions don't support choreographed intimate scenes either. For Stanislavski, the secondary emotion is more likely true theatrical emotion, the one that is analogous to the character's emotion and the true or real for the actor. The analogous secondary emotions are the ideal ones for artistic performance because they can be lured and controlled. Importantly, these are real emotions for the actor based on the feelings in their body created from stimuli, from memories, imagination, and sensory inputs. Although different brain areas are more highly activated in primary versus secondary emotions, it's important that they are not totally separate processes. Current understandings of cognitive science reflect this understanding as well. Neuroscientists David J. Anderson and Ralph Adolphs propose that emotion primitives are the evolutionary building blocks of emotion, which are shared across different emotions and among different species. The resulting species typical behaviors associated with emotions may be drastically different, however. Primates that have developed extensive higher order cortex, like humans, will have additional pathways and processes leading to different behaviors. But the core of the emotion is the same, according to this view. So animals other than humans may have these central emotion states, but may not have conscious awareness of them. Humans, however, give voice to the bodily experiences as feelings. Anderson and Adolph's theory differs from many emotion models that separate each individual emotion into completely different processes. Instead, emotion primitives would be a common base from which the outward behaviors, such as crying, sneered lips, or wide eyes, etc., can have a similar expression. This process reinforces the possibility of the presence of analogous emotions, stemming from the same emotion primitive, but traveling in different pathways, even resulting, though, in similar feeling expressions. In this light, Stanislavski's primary and secondary emotions may stem from the same emotion primitives. For instance, the fear primitive triggered in response to an oncoming car in my path, Stanislavski's primary emotion, may be the same fear primitive triggered when I act out the story at a safe distance afterwards, Stanislavski's secondary emotion. Although the primitive fear central emotion state may be the same in these two circumstances, the subsequent pathway of each may be different, as my mind factors in immediacy of threat, environment, my audience, and other factors. I think these differences in emotions have huge implications for staging intimacy. Take this difference in processes in staging an intimate scene. So primary emotions would likely be created by kind of the old school method of sending the actors out in the hall to make out and find their chemistry. And this may cause actors to experience the motion in a method type way, which has been discussed as not terribly helpful to the actor. In contrast, non-sexualized language, precise choreography, allow a distance between character and actor during the intimate moments of rehearsal and provides a controllable container for secondary emotions during performance. Old school methods of staging intimacy where the actors figure it out for themselves can certainly lead to the experiencing of primary emotions. They're not only more difficult to control, they can cause confusion and negative emotional outcomes for the actors afterwards. Staging intimacy is even more crucial than other emotion situations because our bodies have extensive neural networks to respond emotionally and physically to touch, especially kissing, that usually accompanies intimate scenes. The intervention of an intimacy choreographer can help stop these primary emotions from occurring during the staging process. And having specific choreography, including levels of touch and rhythms, will also help boost the experience into secondary emotions during performance as well. Well, after the Me Too movement, most of us would agree that the first process I mentioned about sending the actors out to figure it out is distressing and confusing for the actors. And Stanislavski stressed that primary emotion on stage can be harmful to an actor's mental health. A fictional example in an actor's work is when a student, Darya, is performing an etude in which she must hold and protect the imaginary child. Apparently, unknown to the teacher, Tortsov, Darya's own baby had recently died. Tortsov asked her to perform the etude again with the adjustment that the imaginary child had just died. When Tortsov heard about her recent tragedy, he was horrified and ran into the stage to stop her. Stanislavski was stressing the delicacy of using actors' personal stories and emotions in performance in all cases. Sorry for the construction outside my window. In addition, even though many people associate Stanislavski with the practice of effective memory exercises, he actually used it cautiously, even in the first studio. He was concerned how it may affect actors' mental hygiene, as Sharon Carnegie notes. In fact, Stanislavski worried that the personal associations could threaten the actor's focus on the play and confuse acting with self-expression. In conclusion, Stanislavski differentiated between emotions in performance and actors' own personal emotions that are spontaneously generated. He asserted that the emotions expressed can be analogous to a character's emotion, while not the same, may still be genuinely experienced by the actor. If the emotion primitives are the same, then they can be both real but follow different pathways after diverging from their common primitive. In the case of intimacy, perhaps these differing pathways may help focus the actor and keep them in a healthy emotional frame. Stanislavski understood that actors can be both real in performance and have a separation between self and character. He says, "While I act, I live a double life. I laugh and cry, still I analyze my tears and my laughter in order that they can affect more strongly the hearts of those I want to touch." He continues the thought, insisting that the dividing of oneself does not interfere with inspiration. On the contrary, one helps the other. Likewise, focusing on choreography during an intimate scene can help keep actors in secondary emotional states, enhancing inspiration and their performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Joelle. Next up is Kaya Dunn. She teaches at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and is affiliate faculty for TIE, Theatrical Intimacy Education. Kaya just received the Kennedy Center Gold Medallion Award. Congratulations, Kaya.
Thank you.
And the presentation today is Consent, Choreography, and Technique.
And I'm hoping my sound does not also go crazy. We have a few things going on around me, so forgive me, I'm on location directing. So I wanted to talk, when Joelle first approached me about this question, because so much of my work deals with both race and intimacy and race and pedagogy, my first thing was, who's saying this and why? And so rather than focus on the specifics of individual points of Stanislavski, I want to focus on the question of what technique is for and what consent is for. And if we are looking at Stanislavski as a tool to help actors be truthful on stage, then my question is, where is consent analogous to that? Where is consent problematic to that? So we've talked a lot. There's been some great presentations by my co-hosts about how choreography is helpful, right? It gives the actor somewhere to go. It separates primary and secondary emotions. It gives us a safe way to go forward. But intimacy choreography isn't just about the choreography part. It's about teaching actors that their boundaries count, that their boundaries are fine exactly where they are, and how to get the most work from their boundaries. And my experience both as a scholar and as a teacher is one that when actors know that their boundaries are respected, they're much more likely to explore, to be free to look at imaginary circumstances, to be freed to push themselves into the uncomfortable, which is different than boundaries, right? I had this talk today where someone's like, well, if actors don't grow outside their boundaries. And I think often we conflate discomfort with boundaries. So you can be uncomfortable. Acting is uncomfortable. Memorizing your lines for me is uncomfortable, right? Being on stage, doing something new is very uncomfortable. But having a boundary, I am not okay with my nipples being shown on stage, or I cannot be touched here, right? Once we know that we have taken care of those things, this is where I'm okay being touched. We've done our boundary practice. Then there's a whole room to explore. There's space to be free because you're not worried about being harmed. And I found it really interesting when Vanessa talked about the acceptance of stage choreography. And I think there's a gender dynamic to that we don't often talk about, the same way there's a racial dynamic to consent. And so when we look at when Stanislavski was coming about and the way that it's taught in the United States, we get into this industrial model of theater, right? It becomes very hierarchical. I have ordered you, therefore. I've been through 3 conservatories, and I've been delighted to see that the way that conservatories are changing, because when I went, it was very very much a break you down to build you up model. And the idea behind that, we're going to break down actors' egos so they can hear us, there's a validity to being able to hear your teacher, to being able to listen, to being able to understand. But there's also a problem in if you don't know a student, if you don't understand a student's culture, if you don't understand where a student's coming from or how, or what you're actually asking them to do, then all we're doing is breaking someone down and not building them back up, right? And so with things like culturally competent pedagogy, the understanding of different racial perspectives, and intimacy choreography, we're now giving students the space to build on who they bring into the room. Because acting is always about how you use your own imagination, how we bring ourselves into the room and then live in imaginary circumstances, right? And so if we're not giving safe structure to understand imaginary circumstances, if we don't have protocols, we're not okay. And back to this idea of it's gendered, no one ever said, oh my gosh, if you don't allow me to use a real sword and hack at someone, you are inhibiting my process. We understand implicitly that that's not okay. It's not okay to be punched in the face on stage. And so I find it really curious that in a situation where somebody's boundaries around sex would be violated, now we're having questions about consent and does this work in conjunction with our technique, right? Well, of course it does. The same way we wouldn't ask somebody to act in an unsafe stage, right? We don't want actors to be in places where they could get hurt. And so to even ask the question, I would ask, how are you using Stanislavski? Why are you using it? I would really encourage anyone who hasn't to go back and watch the S word on race and Stanislavski, because the two are not separate. There's intersectionality that's happening here, right? We're talking about race and gender. What is this supposed to do? Because Stanislavski isn't a god unto himself. Again, it's a technique that should be a tool. And so who are we helping? How are we going forward? And are we sacrificing actors and training actors for the sake of an ideal or a technique? Because that's really problematic. And Nicole Brewer said in her presentation in Race and Stanislavski, we have people coming out of schools that are absolutely terrorized and they're leaving the field for years. And I would argue that's not healthy for anybody, nor is it healthy when you go back and look at teachers who are encouraging victimization of women. There's a great HowlRound article that talks about Me Too and different American acting methods. And it talks about the ways in which all of these techniques are gendered and encourage male aggression and female terror or victimization, right? And one of the things that having boundaries, having intimacy choreography, having a practice around this allows us to do is to allow everybody to show up as their full selves, to allow everybody to show up in a way that allows them to be truthful on stage, to express themselves fully. And so for me, the question of, are these two compatible isn't necessarily the right question. Oops, did I freeze? I'm so sorry. The question about are these two compatible is not the right question. The question should, how are we best helping the actor be true on stage? And so I'm sorry, I know there's some technical glitches. I will wrap it up and thank you so much.
Thank you, Kaya. It must be all those palm trees behind you. They're interfering with your signal. I'm just jealous of your palm trees, I think. Okay, we're going to move on to our final presenter, and that is Emily Raleigh. Emily has a PhD and teaches at Central Washington University. She is assistant faculty for TIE, Theatrical Intimacy Education. And today, Emily will present Relaxed Readiness, Increased Awareness, and Intimacy Protocols, Increasing Actors' Agency and Authenticity in Stanislavski's System. Emily?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for all of the words and all of these insights. It is so lovely to be in space with these fabulous voices and all of these perspectives. I'm really grateful for the folks also who are joining us, and I'm recognizing the fact that this is the 5th person you've heard talk about this. Your brains are probably full, so I also invite you to move, stand, breathe, get a snack, fill up your coffee, whatever you need to do at this point. Because I recognize that listening, especially in the Zoomiverse, for multiple presenters can be challenging. So I invite you to do that as you listen and engage in the ways that you're able to. I'd like to start with a bit of context and a bit of a case study, or learning through storytelling, as the case might be. So each fall, I teach our basic acting, which enrolls our incoming BFA performance, BFA musical theater, and the BA students who have an interest in performance emphasis. And the course intentionally offers a look at various acting methods and techniques, as Kaya was so eloquently talking about, in an attempt to recognize and reflect global and decolonized approaches. So we talk about Augusta Boal, we talk about viewpoints, we incorporate Black acting methods. However, there is admittedly a focus on the basic foundations of Stanislavski's system, as that is then built on in later courses in the sequence by some of my colleagues in looking at some other methods and techniques. The goal is to give our actors tools to be able to work as professionals, kind of flashing back to what Vanessa was saying, to offer them professional tools to work in the field. We start the class, however, with intimacy protocols and tools for intimacy, setting boundaries and consent that sees us through our study in the course overall and in our entire program. So I offer my students a self-care cue to pause action, to take a moment to breathe, to release the amygdala hijack that might happen in heightened moments of concern or forced decision-making. We discuss boundary practice and ways to articulate our physical boundaries, as well as our personal, professional, and cultural boundaries, so that our actors are active, willing co-creators, to borrow a term that Joelle used, in the collaborative process, rather than puppets moving on the stage. Then, of course, we move through some other units until we do come to Stanislavski in more depth. The story. This past year, we'll call her B, a non-traditional student who is also interested in psychology, was in our Basic 1 class with me, and she commented initially and questioned the need to think about and specifically articulate consent and boundaries as it related to our intimacy protocols and techniques. So in an early journal entry to me, she asked if these intimacy protocols distracted from the authenticity of a performance and the actor's connection, her words, with character and true performance. However, by the end of class, working through the sequence, using the protocols and the intimacy tools that we've used, she approached me and she said, I get it. I see how our intimacy work actually let me be in the moment more fully. I could be authentic, I could be focused because I had the technique. I knew what the physical actions of touch were. I knew how to articulate my boundaries so it didn't cloud my performance with stress, which actually impacted my character. I see what you're doing here, Dr. R. It really makes sense. And that was a lovely moment of clarity coming from a student who similarly in this provocation questioned how the intimacy protocols, the awareness, boundaries, and being able to articulate those in the process might impede the actor's so-called authentic response, but actually found her way to seeing how it actually helped and furthered that by, as Dan was talking about, allowing actors to separate between character and actor. This interaction with B prompted me to think more deeply about the ways that intimacy and consent-based practices are infused in my class and serve to reinforce elements of the Stanislavski system and techniques overall, in addition to simply offering students a stronger, more sustainable, holistic approach in terms of mental health as they step into characters who have very different and sometimes challenging events confront them. Similar to what Kaya was just so eloquently saying, it's not about avoiding discomfort, because acting and performance are inherently uncomfortable, but it's about giving the tools to the actors so that they can create authentic, believable characters to, record of TIE says often, poeticize the discomfort of the given circumstances. And indeed, as Stanislavski writes, if, quote, the aim of the actor should be to use his technique to turn the play into theatrical reality, then this is very true of intimacy protocols, as you've heard my fabulous colleagues articulate in several different avenues here today. And as my student B noted, they are indeed a technique. It allows the reality to emerge through viewing the technique in the physical moments of intimacy through the lens of the given circumstances. And so while my colleagues here have pointed to several areas, both large and small, where we see the benefits of incorporating intimacy protocols with Stanislavski's system, there's two areas that I particularly find beneficial to consider as well, and they're connected to each other certainly, which is relaxation and concentration. If Stanislavski's system, as I understand it, is a technique for helping find authentic creation, then I also see intimacy protocols such as the self-care cue to pause, take a breath, fully consent to what's happening, consent-based practices, and working within our boundaries, they similarly allow and encourage that same authenticity. They draw on trauma-informed practices rather than trauma-based practices, so it ensures the actor knows what is coming and has the tools to help pause the action to ensure consent, especially in regard to intimate moments, but that extends more broadly as well. Thus, the intimacy protocols and the tools offer space for an actor to fully and authentically consent, rather than relying on or asking or prompting a connection to trauma. It's that notion that Vanessa said, it's not from the self is different than as the self, that distinction. I think this is particularly tied to our consideration of relaxation, or what I use in my class, relaxed readiness, that we can be relaxed, able to take on what comes to us in the scene, and as we're developing our character, consent to what is happening in the scene. Disclaimer, I'm also a yoga instructor. So this notion of relaxed readiness very much ties to that interest in yoga and Stanislavski's practice and use of yoga, incorporation of that for physical training, and in some ways, some larger elements of the system, which is an entirely different conversation, to be sure. What the relaxed readiness or relaxation does within the system or the technique of Stanislavski is it allows and leads to an opportunity for full concentration and full presence and awareness. And I think the term awareness is key here because it allows then that similar authenticity. And in the same way, intimacy protocols ensure that actors are not necessarily triggered into trauma that then would put a barrier to their presence. As Joelle was talking about, that amygdala hijack, that moment where the reptilian or instinctual brain turns on and sends the actor into fight, flight, or freeze. Rather, intimacy protocols are designed to allow presence and awareness, which directly connects to that sense of relaxed readiness. I can be present in this space, I'm ready to engage without that tension of the amygdala hijack or the fear of unknowing what's coming next. That then allows the concentration. So intimacy protocols and practices allow an actor to neurocognitively enter a space of relaxed readiness rather than fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. They allow an actor to, pulling from Stanislavski, quote, do on stage truthfully and consciously with your full instrument and awareness. So it cultivates this relaxed readiness and awareness or concentration within the intimacy protocols. Using deloaded, desexualized language for the physical body and the actions, we allow the actor to exist in this mental, emotional space that allows them to be focused, relaxed, ready, and aware, rather than on guard, uncertain, or potentially triggered. By offering de-rolling techniques, which help actors step out of character and separate character from actor, it allows the actors to concentrate on the performance and the moment and actually be present and aware to understand character motivations. A secondary story, as I move towards the end of my thoughts here, I've really found recently with student actors in particular, that this awareness and de-rolling technique as it comes from intimacy protocols allows an actor to make more informed character choices as they create their character on stage. In working with an actor recently as I choreographed In the Blood by Susan Laurie Parks, we did the boundary practice first as actor, and then we talked through the boundary practice as character. And that distinction allowed the actor to see the difference, be more aware of those differences, and then make more informed choices because she was relaxed, ready, and aware, and then could move into that method of physical action more informed and consensually. All of that said, Stanislavski talks a lot about how the system is like a science, it's a technique, it's there to be applied, explored, and continued to be developed. And in my view, it's an offering, a tool to help actors become artistic agents and contributors. And as such, intimacy protocols align and support that idea. Sharon Carnecke's book, Stanislavski in Focus, she tells a story about 3 months before his death. Stanislavski cautioned his directing students that, quote, one must give actors various paths. And I would advocate that intimacy tools, consent-based protocols are one such important path to be true, authentic, and aware co-creators who can be relaxed and ready in the space to then concentrate on the role at hand and work in a way that is productive, effective, and efficient. Thanks, everybody. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Emily, and to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for all of your wonderful presentations today. Attendees, I would invite you to formulate your questions, your thoughts, and drop them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. A couple have come in and have been answered there. While we're giving folks just a moment to digest and prepare their questions, just a technical question that I don't know the answer to, which is how long after today's session will the recording be available? Joelle, do you have any idea about that?
Yes, once I get a chance to edit it, so probably in a week or so, we'll be putting it up on the Stanislavski Here Today Now website, and it should be there in perpetuity after that. So you should be able to have access to it there.
Wonderful, thank you. I also realized there was a question that was asked very early on that I accidentally did not publish to everyone, so sorry about that, but they had asked about captions, and when the video goes up, there are captions that will be there. So I answered that one privately, but for everyone to know, captions will be available. And there's some more information that's been dropped in the Q&A as well. You can see there, Kaya, thank you for sharing the link. You were faster than I was, which is great. So let's see.
There were some questions about sources, and I think that actually got answered throughout. It seemed a lot of you referenced a few of the same sources, so clearly those are some leaders here in our field. There's a rather lengthy question that I might have to just read all of because I don't want to miss all the juiciness, if that's okay. And I think this one can go to all of you panelists. It appears that this person is asking about something that nobody really touched on, so perhaps someone will have a thought. The attendee says, none of the panelists have addressed how Stanislavski fundamentally differentiated his work from the work to which he was responding as the art of experiencing instead of the art of representation. Carnecke goes so far as to refer to experiencing is this, oh, you're gonna make me speak another language. Sine qua non, that's probably wrong, of the system, given that there are certainly experiences that we do not want actors/students to experience, primarily violence, intimacy, etc. How do we navigate this without falling into merely representing? Or is it okay to just admit that these are moments where Stanislavski's own fundamental definition breaks down? So that was a juicy one. Do any of our panelists want to address that?
I'll jump in on that one if it's all right, because yes, absolutely, experiencing is one of the key things that Stanislavski wants, as Sharon Carnecke talks about, and yet he also says that that's not something that's desired all the time. That there are other things that have to happen. That your mind does have to have two different things going on at the same time, and that there are moments when different kinds of control are needed. So they can both be true, where there are moments, and he says it only happens for brief moments, this experiencing, doesn't happen throughout a performance, that having those brief moments are a wonderful, lovely thing, but you also have to take all these other things into consideration. I mean, he did opera and, was very concerned about vocal performance and physical performance and all these different things. So that would be my answer to that. Someone else wants to follow in?
I think the difference is subtle and depends on the individual situation. What's the difference between stock and trade, which is the words that at least Benedetti translates it as, and authentic experiencing? I'd say if you read the book, you look at the examples that Stanislavsky gives, and it's always about, you know, the difference between something in general, which there's a whole thing on somewhere around page 62 on his feelings, or 65 on his feelings on about in general. And I actually think sometimes some of the attempts to be authentic, at least in terms of that style of teaching and acting that I'm talking about, results in generalism. I love that quote that Joel pulled up about, you know, and the restraint. And so I don't know, it's subtle, it's subtle. I think it's very, very subtle. And I think the difference is not, sometimes it might result in the same thing. Cliches are cliches for a reason, right? You can authentically come to a very cliche moment and it can be beautiful. So, you know, I don't know, that's just about actual practice and what you are doing as practitioners. I think not necessarily about like, hey, it's an easy answer, that's cliche and that's not. It's a process.
I just think we always have safety steps and protocols because it's a workplace environment, right? And we're teaching students to be in a workplace environment. And so there's, you know, there is always an art form that's like, oh no, we must, you know, put our lives in danger to experience, but that's not the world I want to work in. That's not the world I want to live in. And if I'm looking at how we live in community, how we have a more inclusive, not even inclusive, but like just competent, good theater where people can tell their stories, then what are the rules we're playing by, right? That's not antithetical to any technique or any form of art. And every place has that. We don't allow teachers to kiss students, hopefully, on most campuses, because, you know, if they feel swept away with the moment. 10 years ago, I know people who would argue that that was, you know, limiting people's artistic ability or ability to do, you know, and I do want to say, we've said a couple of times like, oh, well, this is post Me Too, but I want to point out, you know, and I point this out at TIE when we do workshops, but this work has been happening for a very long time. When you look at the work of people like Dr. Barbara Ann Tier, or especially women of color, there has always been a focus on consent and psychologically healthy practices. Barbara Ann Tier wrote a book about it when she did the Tier technique back in the 60s, and she's an African-American woman. So if you're interested in Sherelle's work, I encourage you to also look at some of her foremothers. But this is not new. It's just new to people who've had the luxury of ignoring it for a really long time.
Great. Thank you for your responses to the question. We have another question that has been dropped into the Q&A that says, I'm curious how any of the panelists might have dealt with the situation I had in my teaching. A girl in the cast of a play I had directed had been raped when she was younger and was resistant to kissing another actor. I'm wondering if anyone has a response. Kai, I see your hand up. Would you like to start?
Yeah, because I just think I love things that have really practical answers. And one of the things, if you know, depending on how much you know about intimacy, any sort of physical contact is put in the audition form when you audition. The same way we ask if you tap dance, are you comfortable with kissing on stage? Are you comfortable with partial nudity? There's hugs. You make a list and you put it in the contract before or in the audition form. And that way it doesn't become, hey, we really want to give you this lead, but we need you to do something, especially in a school setting. I mean, this is professionally too, but in a school setting, there really needs to be clear explanation of what physicality is allowed. And then you as the director can decide, do I absolutely need this to tell the story? Is there another way to choreograph this? Usually there is. But if not, then you don't cast that actor. But we don't ask somebody, most of us aren't psychologists, right? We don't ask somebody to overlook their trauma to tell a story. This is something I did a long time ago. I went to a faith-based school and they introduced this idea of like, your body is yours. And if there's something you don't want to do, doesn't mean it doesn't come without consequences, right? I talk to my students about that. If your boundary is that you will not kiss, yeah, there's going to be some parts that you won't get. But one of my boundaries was there were certain roles I wouldn't take because they fell into a racial trope. And I am okay giving up those roles, right? But we're teaching people to be storytellers and to tell their authentic stories, which means they have to be comfortable in the ways that their bodies are being used to tell those stories. There's an element of embodiment. And I will say, both on set, so I've directed film and TV, where especially younger actors have not kissed outside of film and have been traumatized by having their first kiss on film, and care not crafted around that. And I've also, and it gets increasing as I teach longer. So I've taught for about 10, 12 years. I've had a lot of students who've never been kissed. You're not going to have your first kiss in my acting class. Like, that's just, I mean, unless you really want to, but like, for me, there's so many other things that we can do, and that's a really special experience. And so giving them autonomy on how that goes forward and the care we craft around that is really, really important. And that starts with how you formulate your audition.
I would also add too, like, I love that, Kaya. Thank you. Like, we need to put it out there right away. And then if boundaries change in the rehearsal space, right? Because we don't always know when we might have a response as, you know, a performer to something. We never know what might trigger or, you know, prompt that. If boundaries change in the rehearsal space, Kaya said it, there's a million ways to tell a story, right? So does it have to be a kiss? The answer is probably not, right? There's so many different ways to tell a story. And I think what intimacy protocols and these ideas around consent and boundaries offer us is the creative container in which we can then create, right? And make this moment, the storytelling, right? We're trying to, as Kaya said, tell the stories. And there's so many different ways. So even if boundaries change in the rehearsal space, that's okay too, because we have the tools to be able to encounter that. And that's often what we do in rehearsal, right? We walk in with one perception of something, and as we work, we develop. Similarly so, in terms of boundaries, they might change and shift. And yes, sometimes there's absolutely consequences, which I think is an important conversation, but we can allow boundaries to shift and still work within them to tell the story that we're trying to tell for that character and for the play. So just wanted to recognize that shift too, which is.
All right. There's a lot of great thoughts coming in about this actor versus character business we've been discussing. Nods to Grenke, acknowledging that we are living through the role, not living the role. Someone else has added that Benedetti's translation focuses on dual perspective and dual consciousness, and that's a great tool as well. Experiencing the character is different than experiencing the self. So a lot of folks seem interested in this duality today. Let's see. Here is a question. As an actor, I've experienced a lot of directors wanting to do improvs at the start of rehearsals before in-depth script work in order to discover character traits, and it often feels premature and unclear and possibly unsafe. Do any of you have thoughts or suggestions on what would be needed to create more specific or safe containers for improvs, and or what's best to do in these situations? So I'll open that up to the panel.
Sure. I think the things that have been talked about so far in terms of immediately start off with is consent work. How consent is based for every performance, every rehearsal process. If it's not done from the very beginning and as a basis for the entire process, it's going to be problematic. And so even before you do any type of improvs, that has to be the basis for that. You need to have the boundary talks. You have to have just quite a bit of time spent with understanding what consent is and what that process is. In a university setting, you might have need a little less time if you're doing that in class as well, and they already have some understanding of that. Otherwise, you need to really take the time to do that. And if it's not being done and you're the actor in that situation and you feel uncomfortable with it, that's something you could maybe discuss with the director, because it's something that's kind of new for people. At least you can always pull your scene partner around and say, hey, let's talk for a minute before we get going, and let's do this work privately, even if you can't do it among the larger group, if you're in that position as an actor rather than as a director. But if you're having a position to have any kind of power whatsoever, I think it's imperative that we do the work beforehand, because yeah, things do come up in improv, but if the improv person does, they can have that respect once again, no one's going to be crossing your own boundaries. That gives you a lot more room, as everybody's talked about, for exploring the work within there. And then also tools like TIA's button, or I always say TIE's button, or timeout, things like that. Always have those tools available for them as well, so that people can pause if they need to at any time within there.
Wonderful. Another question that's come through for the panel: are there any Stanislavskian tools for script analysis that you find helpful for staging intimacy? How much is a focus on intention, motivation helpful? And when does that focus bleed over into dictating desire or sexualizing a space?
Nobody has their script analysis hat on today, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think some of it has to do with just the idea that, again, given it all depends to something that Kaya has brought up for us is, again, it's cultural competency. You have to know when you're walking in whether there's given circumstances in the script that are problematic, which there probably are because of the world that we live in and the world that the writer you're working with lived in. And so it's just a matter of looking at your basic tools and just going through it and saying, what's going to be something that might be problematic for somebody? What's something that might be sexualized or somebody might experience in a way that we need to change the language and the way we talk about it? I hope that's kind of answering the question, because again, the more we analyze the character and help create an idea of separation and what this is and what we're creating, but also then honoring who the people are in the room, because again, that's part of the given circumstances. It's not just in the script. Script analysis can't just be this thing where the script is this separate thing from us and from the context. It has to be put into the context.
So I'd also say, oh, I'm sorry, Dan.
No, sorry. I was putting a silly button on it. You go.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I would also say, like, we don't have this question with things that keep aggression safe, right? Like, we don't have the question, if we choreograph the swords or the knives, are we taking the violence out of the script? We understand that. Right? And it's the same thing with sexuality. Just because you're saying you're desexualizing the language, and for those of you who don't have a background in intimacy, what we mean is not that we're taking the romance or the attraction or the love out of the script, but we're using things, instead of me saying I'm going to passionately French kiss Emily, right? And grab her breast, because that's something that I would do in the bedroom. I'm going to put my nose to Emily's left temple and then bring it down to the corner of her mouth and reach my hand to the left side of her chest area, right? So I'm not using the words that I would use in the bedroom: breast, vagina, right? I'm talking about groins. I'm using movement terms: slow, fast. We have different levels of touch in TIE. Different people do it different ways, but it's about making the language about movement and choreography rather than about things that we associate with sexual practice. The result is the same. I've been on set where we've talked about, a figure 8 and loud grunting sounds until you build speed to a relaxation and a release. And it looks like fast, passionate sex to orgasm. But we don't use those words because those are words we use in the bedroom. And it's very uncomfortable to be on set with minimal clothing on and have somebody talk about orgasm. That is the purpose of this. But when you as an audience member watch it, when a director sees it, they see the same exact thing. And so I do want to clarify that, because I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat. Excuse me, there are planes flying overhead. I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat about, well, how do we do this but not talk about sex or intimacy or romance? All of that is there. This, in fact, what I've seen it do most frequently is make the scenes more passionate visually, because people feel safe. It's not you telling an 18-year-old, like I was told, oh, come in and take off your clothes and have a rape scene in the corner, right? You're going to be super conscientious, self-conscious. You're going to feel restricted. But if somebody tells me to the beat of 5, let somebody hold you, they're going to grab your arm, I'm going to go down, and so that we have all the moves the same way we would do a fight scene, because I'm going to flinch and pull back if you tell me Dan's going to punch me in the face every time we do a scene. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about having a practice and a rehearsal and something that's repeatable. One of the TIE shirts says passion fades, choreography lasts forever, right? And I love that because it's like, yeah, the same way we don't go on stage and just act our emotions and hope we remember our lines. This is about having a discipline and a practice. It doesn't take away the storytelling, it actually enhances it. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I do want to make that clarification because I'm seeing a lot of questions around that.
Yeah, I think that's great, Kaya. There was another question that I think you just answered about the desexualized body and when is it safe for the body to be sexual. But I think, you know, you've hit that nail on the head there. So I'm not even going to read that whole question. Instead, I'll move on to the last question that is in the chat. We do have a little bit longer. If you have another question or two, throw them in there. We'll try to wrap up in the next 8 or 9, 10 minutes or so. But after this question, if there is anyone else, please, we encourage you to drop something in the Q&A. So this question says, what is being done to include the psychologist into the studio setting? Does anyone have any thoughts or information on that? The psychologist.
I don't understand the question, sorry.
That's all I've got in the question, but certainly I think we'd.
Sure, I'll say, I think Emily hit on this about the difference between trauma-informed practice versus trauma-based. So we aren't coming in going, okay, intimacy is for all the, and I think often people think, oh, this is for the females who've been sexually assaulted, because we've heard so much about that. When we're talking about trauma-informed practice, we're giving people an awareness of, you know, you may encounter these things in the room, but this practice works for everybody and helps prevent trauma from happening, right? So the same way, you know, we're going to practice good rehearsal and it's going to help that person that can never remember their lines. It's also going to help all the actors. It is a different thing to talk about how do we get a man or a woman who's experienced sexual abuse or sexual trauma in their past to be able to perform on stage. That is not the work of theatrical intimacy. The work of theatrical intimacy is providing a discipline and a practice for film or theater so that we can tell stories of intimacy effectively and make them repeatable, right? And so that we have a language with which to continue to do this. And so when we start to talk about psychologists and how we deal with people's trauma, that gets into a different thing about, you know, trauma-based teaching and where to acting. And I think that's a whole other seminar we could probably have on Stanislavski.
And I would add to that, that having resources available, that's one thing you try to do at being a trauma-informed teacher or choreographer of anything. So you have resources available so you can point the student to the right people to get the help they need if they seem to require that. You can offer that to them at least, so they can get that helpful, because that's not our jobs. We're not good at that. That's something we certainly aren't qualified to be doing.
If what the questioner means also is just where does psychology fall? I mean, look at Joelle's presentation and all the work that she's doing in terms of connecting psychological research to the work. And the more that, at least from what limited stuff I've seen that people are doing with that, is proving what we know to be true, that these things do connect and that emotion is connected to the physical and cannot be separated, and that we need to deal with the fact that that connection exists in a healthy way. And in a way that, again, takes care of our students, for those of us who are teachers, and takes care of our performers, for those of us who work as choreographers and directors and other leaders in the field. So, I mean, it is entering the work in that way, and in terms of research that others are doing, not me. But thank you, Joelle, for doing that kind of work, because it enriches my work.
I would agree with that, but I'd also say inviting in anyone's trauma and anything is part of their personal. It belongs to them. It's part of their. It's almost like almost abusive if we say, "Oh, bring it in." You know, it's not. It doesn't belong to that space because it's their own thing, and that's kind of special. Our own thing is our own thing. So I'd say it belongs outside of the room. Or they're protected so that they can work, yeah.
Wonderful. Looks like we have one other question that's come in, wondering about recommendations for a stage intimacy text, and apologizing if they missed that in an earlier conversation. Does anyone have any resources that they'd like to share?
Chelsea Pace's book, Staging Sex, is probably the current form, written form that you're going to find a lot of how-tos and how not tos and some of the background behind it. It's an incredible book, and I could highly recommend that one. There's lots of articles out there as well, and a lot of different people like Kai are doing different work, extending it into different realms and kind of looking at it in an intersectional place as well. So look at their writings as well.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I'm doing actually looks at the big bad word right now, critical race theory, but the historical, and I would encourage especially anybody who's white identifying, particularly if you're a white identifying female, to look at books around assault and slavery and the history of white women. So things like They Were Her Property are really good books to read, because I think sometimes we enter this space with sort of this idea of neutrality, especially if we identify as female. And there's a really hard intersectional history behind dictating sexual practices and mores. And I think that's really important to know about. I read that as test. And so the one thing I would say is there's lots of different ways to assess. And I know that, I know all about the SDC test and that there are steps, but I would say be really careful about gatekeeping and the way that for me, one of the things that's exciting, even though many people do both staged violence and staged intimacy, one of the things that's exciting about staged intimacy is it really is about helping students to articulate their boundaries and helping to figure out the ways that we choreograph. And I think we can sort of move away from this very colonized version of you're good, you're bad, there's a scarce number, and, but like helping rather than encouraging, like, here's the end of the year test. How are you going to present? How are you going to choreograph? Can we build on something together? Can you try a recipe on this scene? Can you notate like a recipe that you're watching from something that you've seen, right? Rather than saying like, here's the test that we're going to have, and if you get this, you're qualified to do such and such. I think there's value in having like qualifying hours. So I've attended this workshop and this workshop, and I understand this concept. But I just really, as an acting teacher, I really try to stay away from like, here's the test that tells you you've done it and you're done. One, because this field is rapidly evolving. And two, because there's so many more creative and interesting ways to assess what students are learning. So if it was test and not text, I just wanted to present that offering into the space.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me I lost it, there we go. I think we have just about reached the end of our time, and I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So I will go ahead and thank all of our panelists for their contributions today and attendees for your thoughtful questions on behalf of the S-Word and the Stanislavsky Center. The S-Word is a completely collaborative project. The webinars are starting points. They're not finishing points. So please take the opportunity of contacting the center and continuing the dialogue. They would also love to hear what you would like them to explore next. You can reach them through the website, Stanislavsky, Here, Today, Now, and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We would like to thank everybody again for participating today. Thank you so much, and stay well, everyone.